let's share my screen. So all those boring people who always talk about travel and cooking and music and things, they've got nothing on us, because when we go to parties, we can talk about type and grids. It's a guaranteed success. You'll make lots of new friends. They, of course, they completely understand what you're talking about and the importance of talking about grids. Unless you run into an architect, because architects then are going to tell you what a grid is. Because they, of course, they feel they invented it. So, which maybe is also true, partly. So, the typeface, by the way, that I use is called Favorit by Dynamo Type Foundry. So today I want to show some examples, some methodologies, so technical instruction in InDesign. Maybe we can go into how to actually use the grid. And how to flow text, some recommendations, etc. And another time, I don't know if that's going to be next week or maybe the week after, that's something I think we just need to see, is more focused on automation. And that's not as long. That's, I think, maybe 1 hour, or maybe less, kind of depends. And that could even be a kind of tutorial that I pre-record. So let's just see how today goes. Today will go, and then we'll just adjust accordingly. So what is a grid? So basically, a grid is nothing more really than a framework or structure used to organize content. And I think it's important that you really think about the content. So, of course, you can decide to just design a grid and then throw everything in the grid. That is definitely a possibility and sometimes really helpful. But I personally feel that why make a grid if there's no real need for it in terms of the content that you're using or the medium that you're using, for instance. So, roughly when you look at an InDesign document, an InDesign spread, then a grid could look something like this. So you see margins, you see, columns, and there's some horizontal lines that kind of show rows, kind of like a table, like in an Excel sheet. If you zoom in a little bit, or if you make the grid a bit more detailed, then you can add a baseline grid to it. So these blue horizontal lines, they are a baseline grid, and basically they define the distance between the lines of the baselines of the text, so the leading, so grid based on leading. This is something that we use all the time. For those of you who have maybe accidentally clicked the document grid, so you can show all these different layers of grids and structures in InDesign, and you see the document grid. And usually it doesn't look as neat as this. It's like a big mess of squares on top of a baseline grid that doesn't align. And it's because the standard settings don't look like this. But this, for instance, could be a grid. This is kind of what I'll show today, how to make this and why to make this. So basically, a grid subdivides a page vertically and horizontally into margins, columns, spaces between columns, called gutters, but also spaces between content, so blocks of type and images or illustrations or other things. And these subdivisions, so let's say you have an entire page that you cut into smaller pieces, and they form the basis of a more modular, and this is really, let's say, a Swiss, like World War I, post-World War I approach that was developed there, of a modular and systematic approach to layouts. This is particularly useful for doing bigger documents. So, if you do one poster or one page of something, then sometimes you might not use a grid, or you use a very, very simple version of a grid. But then again, if you do a flyer and you have to do a flyer for, I don't know, a venue, like every month or every week, then maybe you'll actually use a grid. So a famous example of it, for instance, is Wim Krauwel's grid for the Stedelijk Museum, where he used the same grid for 20 years for all of the catalogs and the posters, etc., etc. But of course, it's also used for the web, for apps, and even for spaces. So for physical, that's exhibition design, in architecture, grids have been and still are really important. So just some examples of things, that are definitely all grid-based. So, the location of these numbers, for instance, I don't know if it actually is recording my cursor as well. So for instance, the space between the 1 and let's say this column of text and the 2 in a column of text. So you see that the distance between the number and the text is also kind of the same. So, all of those spaces are not just where the text starts, but also space between elements, space between the lines, etc., is all part of a grid. And it makes it a lot easier to organize things and also to constantly reorganize things without having to guess, basically. Of course, you can combine a lot of different type sizes, different typefaces, different aesthetics. Again, you see here, one column text, 2 columns, 3 columns, even rotated footnotes. You can use it for posters. You can show kind of a grid as if it's in a way a puzzle. And even sometimes, when you think it's not there, it's probably still there. I like to watch. I don't like to watch, but I like the photo. And even here, where it seems like nothing is really on the page or not that much, this is still organized, neatly in a grid. So even when it doesn't seem to be there, there's probably an underlying structure that's been used. When the typography looks really rough and unrefined, then there's probably still structure underneath. I would not recommend to do any of this, fully justifying all the text, because you get all these rivers of white. And here, to the right, I think you could argue that it's I don't know, for aesthetical purpose. I'm not so sure about all of the text in the center, let's say. But still. Posters by Joseph Müller-Bruckmann. An example of a Krauwel poster or banner with the square grid on the right side. This is Identity for Strelka, a Russian institute. Again, different sizes, 2 columns, 4 columns. But then you see that, for instance, here this Seite and Tony is not on the same column line, so that suggests that there's an even more detailed grid underneath. That's not 4 columns, but for instance, 8, or in this case, probably more like 12. Again, including all types of images and footnotes, multiple columns. This is an artist who kind of paints page layouts. That's one project. I find it quite interesting, but there's still a structure underneath. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle, I showed this before. So 1875 and 1873. This is entirely typeset by hand, which is crazy. More grids, more grids. So some examples of things you could do. So I think it's really important that grids, that you realize or learn that they don't take the experimentation out of your design. They actually help you to organize and to create space for experimentation. So for instance, also in web, of course, grids are being used. And I don't know if this works when sharing the screen. Apparently it doesn't. Okay, I think I need to enable this. Okay, I'll reshare it. I needed to enable something. So this, I hope you can see the video in a recorded website. Of course, all of this is also grid based, as you've also learned in Bente's lessons of building a website. So you can see different subdivisions. When you zoom in, and when you see the menu, it's in all of a sudden turns into, one column turns into 2 columns. Sometimes you see this entire area turn into 3 columns. You have the light box, etc., etc. So all of this also built using a grid. Same for the Chicago Architecture Biennial, designed by Zach Group. So this all looks so playful, even though I fully realize that some of it still looks very maybe Swiss and Dutch, but it's so organized. So if you, for instance, take this one, which maybe is not the most playful one, but definitely very organized, and you basically start discovering or start to search for a structure. Then first, let's say you could, find the margins in this, so the document margins, and those are quite tight. And of course, there's column margins, and now it appears that there's, some kind of gutter in between, so a little bit of space between the columns. So what I then do is I look at the indent, for instance, in the paragraphs, because the indent is not just a random indent. So first I see if there's blocks or rows, because in this design it's quite obvious that they're there and that things do not connect. Let's say, so this text could have been connected, could have been, I don't know, 2 enters, for instance, between the paragraphs, but there's, a whole lot of white space. So this suggests at least that there's blocks here that are being filled or not. So then I'm looking at the indent. So now between the start of the column and the indent, there's a unit that's being used. So this unit, I think, it's not just there coincidentally. This unit is a designed unit. So if I copy it, then I see that actually the gutter between the columns disappears, which also makes sense because the text, both of the columns almost touch each other in the center. They don't entirely touch each other, but it's really, really close. So if I, continue adding this unit, then basically the gutter, so the white space between the columns disappears. So the baseline grid, now adding that to it, and of course this is a bit rough because this is a photo, it's not entirely flat. Baseline grid, and then I think because the baseline grid seems, is more fine, like more refined, it's smaller, the unit used between the baselines. So if I divide the units, like the vertical units, in half, now I have squares. So that kind of resembles more the document grid like that I showed a couple of slides ago. So this is already part of this grid. So why would you use it? So first of all, for clarity and order. doesn't really matter if the content is simple or not, because you've seen the examples, where some things actually look really, really simple, but they still have to be organized, even if there's one word or two words on a page or on a site or in a space, then you still need to organize them in some way. You're not just throwing them in randomly. But especially when you work with highly complex content or lots of layers or multiple languages, for instance, on the same page or in the same space, then you really want to have a structure that helps you to organize. So part of that is also efficiency and speed. So if you have to make a new decision on every page of your book or every corner of your exhibition space, and you every time have to think about distances between objects, about the height of a caption, about the size of something, that will take so much time, which makes it really expensive, so really time consuming, and makes it also difficult to make a decision. So connecting to this clarity and order, you're looking for some kind of harmony or visual consistency, which doesn't mean that everything needs to look the same. It just means that things need to feel related. And of course, the economic reason. If you work with multiple designers or an entire studio, or maybe even multiple studios or subcontractors on a bigger project, then you maybe need a system to keep things organized so that not every designer or every illustrator, every developer make their own rules basically for putting content somewhere or using sizes. And especially when you do large or longer running projects where you maybe have to, like in Krauwel's example, have to design a catalog like every month, for instance, then you also want some kind of a system so that you don't have to spend all the time, every time, to come up with something new. So examples, of course, designers are geeks. So in recent years, a lot of these visual identity manuals have been republished. So they used to be just made for larger companies. You would have an identity manual that would say, this is the logo. If you place a logo on a letterhead, it should be here. If you place a logo on a business card, it should be there. You can use these colors. You cannot use other colors, like blah, blah, all the rules, basically. And for a lot of people, I think these were always really annoying. I think for some people, they were really helpful. Like if you're not a designer and you need to say something about, I don't know, like a campaign, then it's nice if you can, look something up and say, hey, this is the wrong color, or we don't use this color for this department, because, the identity manual states that we cannot. For designers, the identity manual, well, let's say for a specific type of designers, the identity manuals are super annoying because they basically tell you where to put the logo and you want to decide where to put the logo or which typeface to use, or you want to use a different color. But making the identity manual is interesting and is actually really complicated because you have to think about a lot of possibilities. So it's a difficult puzzle. So in recent years, these have been republished. So for instance, this is an example of a grid for the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in the US, which interestingly enough, Trump, I think, put someone in charge that doesn't believe in climate change. But it's an interesting approach, putting someone in charge of the Environmental Protection Agency. How to deal with titles and subtitles in publications or annual reports, for instance. How to use colors, how to use patterns. And of course, these are examples. IBM, the logo itself is designed on a grid. But also, where do you put the logo? How do you combine the logo with the different research laboratories? So these books have been republished. So this one has been republished by Empire, a French small art publisher. I wish we would have had real classes because then I could have brought some of these manuals because of course I'm a geek, so I have them. I really enjoy actually browsing through them because they really show also how a designer was thinking or a team of designers were thinking. Like how do you specify all these things? NASA, I mean, it's great. How do you design, the signage? Which colors do you use? You know, where do you put the signage on, like a car, for instance? So, HVO or Octavo, they were a magazine, but also, more importantly, a studio in the UK. And a quote, so they published this book. It's a really small book, but it has a lot of pages, and it's actually really interesting. The work might look a bit outdated to some, like very 90s, but they've written some really interesting things about their projects. So to get things built, you have to be able to describe them, and the act of specifying requires one to define the structure of a design precisely. And I think that's really interesting when it comes to grids, because you know, when you're designing, no matter how you look at it, you are specifying things. You are kind of, you know, you're designing an instruction. That's literally kind of what you do, because you design something, you know, let's say on the screen, you put something here, you put something there, but what you are actually saying to InDesign, to the software, is put this here and save it, you know, and export it as such a file. So it also is an instruction. You know, if you design an identity manual, you design an instruction. So you do not just design like one thing that you have full control of in a way, but you could also design things that other people then have to start using. So that makes it important to be able to specify what you do and why you do. Like the decisions that you make are specific decisions. And they can, of course, in some way can be completely intuitive or accidental, but then still, when you know, further developing, you are specifying, even if you're making your own design more precise. So I think basically it takes the guessing out of design, but not the experimentation or the play. So you can still do anything, but at some point you're deciding, you know, so you don't have to guess anymore. Where do I put the page number? Where do I start the chapter? Where do I put something in space, etc., etc. So there's different types of grids. So in a grid, for instance, basically roughly you have a text area and margins. This is a spread. So let's say one of the oldest that we know is called a manuscript grid, which is a single column grid, which, you know, if this is a spread of a book, so I'm mostly focusing on publications here, then you have margins and you have a text area. Of course, you have multi-column grids that are symmetrical. So for instance, 2 columns or 3 or 4 or 6 with spaces in between, but they're symmetrical. You can do multi-column grids that are asymmetrical, of course. So symmetry is something that at some point in, let's say, history of publication design or book design, making Bibles, for instance, for hundreds of years they used symmetrical centered layouts that were fully justified mostly. So asymmetry was also modern at some point. So asymmetrical multi-column grids, so different widths. So you could, of course, kind of see what this could mean. So maybe this is I don't know, like a reference guide. There's numbers, then there's some text. Maybe there's a reference to a specific page, and maybe there's a small image, for instance. So different widths of columns. And then you have the modular grid, which is both vertically and horizontally a combination of all of these things. So you could add really complicated layouts. And of course, for instance, this one to the right might look a little bit ridiculous. Like, you know, when are you ever going to design a publication, for instance, that would be so complicated? But if you think of, I don't know, like a school book, like a biology book, or like a mathematical book, or an annual report that includes tables and includes, you know, formulas, and it maybe includes lots of references and quotes and I don't know, you name it, then you might actually use this as an underlying structure. So if we start with the idea of subdivisions, so let's say you have a subdivision of 4 columns in a page. So let's say this yellow beautiful painting is the, let's say, the fundament of the grid. Then on top of this 4-column grid system, you could do 2 columns. Or you could do 1, 2, 1. Or 4. Or 1 and 3. And of course, you can do this in all kinds of combinations. You can even split this into smaller ones if you need to. combine them in all sorts of ways. So if you have 4-column subdivision on a page, 4-column grid, basically, there's a lot of things you can do. But in magazines, really often, because they are, let's say, have include more types of headlines and more types of content, maybe different sizes of text, often 12 columns are used. So then this would be behind, like underneath your design, basically. So let's say 12 columns, you know, it could be 3 or 4, so 3 columns of 4 each, plus gutters. Or for instance, 2, 5, 2, 3. Now it starts getting more modular. So on top of this 12-column grid, you could do a whole lot of combinations. And of course, you could also leave open columns. You don't have to fill everything. So just to be clear about it, so we're talking about columns and rows. And one of those boxes, let's say blocks, is called a module. That's also why this is called a modular grid. The lines are called flow lines. The spaces between the columns are called gutters. And then we have margins. In this case, a running footer or folio. Folio is a page number. Or maybe a running header, like a chapter title or the title of the book or something else. So, a couple of examples. So for instance, this book was designed by Mavis and van Deursen, who also designed the Stedelijk Museum Identity, for instance, for the Architecture Biennial. And they did this in collaboration with students of the Werkplaats. So what they did is they designed a basic grid that does not really include many horizontal lines, so it doesn't really include a baseline grid, but it includes columns, lots of them, and rules. So, and this is the instruction. So this is the typeface you use. For instance, no image outside this area at the bottom, no text outside this area, no text or image outside this area. So X, which is the unit, is 5 millimeters. So this is a 5 millimeter grid. Text can only be positioned in different angles, but only in steps of 15 degrees. And then the text is always ragged left, the type is always black, etc., etc. Images may not bleed off the page. So there's this set of rules. And then they gave each of the 8 students basically content for a section or a chapter. And, you know, and of course, this is this, you know, the age-old problem that we all have is if you see this in your InDesign document, so this right page, for instance, but maybe also even the left one, it looks fucking boring at first, you know, because you don't even have the paper, you don't have, you know, the actual size and the smell of the paper, maybe like a nice color of it or the nice color of the ink. So you're judging this InDesign page, which then might look and feel really boring. But of course, you're designing not one page, but you know, many pages. So, combination of text and images. So you already start seeing a bit more complexity and play here. So all of these were designed by different designers, different students. You know, so now all of a sudden, images can basically go outside of the text columns, which is interesting. I think someone did not get a lot of text. So that was quite nice. You have a lot of pages and not a lot of text, so you can really play with things. This is a magazine that I, together with 2 other people, we used to be a studio called Almanac. We designed Items, which is a design magazine. So for instance, this underlying grid was 16 columns, or 15 plus 1. So what you, for instance, see, this is 4 columns of text. Then the titles, they span the columns, let's say 2 of the columns. And then, for instance, here you can see an image. It takes up 1.5 of these columns. And then there's half a column left for captions, for instance. So underlying, and when I took this screenshot a long time ago, I did not link the images correctly. So that's why the question marks are there. So the reason why I call this 15 plus 1 is so the grid officially is 16 columns. But we decided to use 15 and then so that we could create space to make sure that the images, for instance, could, what happens like at the bottom left, the images would not always align with the text, so that you create some kind of, rhythm or some kind of play. And you could do this on all sides. So you create basically space here for captions next to images, so you create a bit of a different rhythm. So you can see here now how this column is used for that as well. So the first spread was 4 columns, the second one was 3 columns. This one is 2 columns of text, but the underlying grid is exactly the same. And then you might ask, why is this image, for instance, not inside of the grid or not on the same grid lines? And that's actually because of the X height of the text. So at the top, you can see that we added this guide, this ruler guide, because the text has an X height. So the text doesn't fill the baseline unit, let's say, entirely, because it has ascenders and descenders. So what we noticed, I think, after the first issue maybe, is that what we really did not like is that the images, even though they were on the same grid, and the image, for instance, this top right image would be aligned exactly with the top margin, let's say, it would look like it was actually higher than the text, which it was. So we decided to optically change it a little bit to add this guide so that it aligns with the X height. So this only happens when there's text next to the image. If it's not there, then it would just start at the top, for instance. This is not a sex toy, but it's a piece of art, just so you know. So again, different ways of combining images, captions, and text in a grid. This we did not make, and just to show that it's also there in websites and news websites, which is a whole different story, but basically similar. So, oh my God, how do you do this? It's amazing. So, first of all, as a disclaimer, there are many different ways of developing and using a grid. So there's not one way of doing it. So, even if after this instruction or at the end of your studies, you don't have a specific way of doing it, or it's not according to the rules that were defined by, whoever, don't worry about it, because it's there to help you and maybe other people if you work, with multiple designers or something. So you decide how this thing functions, not the other way around. So sometimes that means you ignore it, like I just showed with this example with X height optical correction. That it's not really. I mean, of course, you could redesign the grid and make it more detailed so that it would include all those options. But that was so much more work. Didn't really feel necessary because this worked fine. So sometimes you also ignore things. So grids don't have to be complicated. So you don't have to use 12 columns if you're doing a manuscript type book. If you're typesetting a novel, you don't need 12 columns, probably. So it really is not necessary to make it complicated. Actually, I would say make it as simple as possible, because a grid should help you with the design that you're doing, not with something, with some bullshit project that doesn't need a complicated grid. So one way of doing it is defining the text area based on geometry. So after Chicholt, like this is an idea of how to define a text area. So let's say this is a spread. Someone is joining now. This is a spread. So if you draw a diagonal from, let's say, the top left to the bottom right of the spread, and then from the top or the bottom left to the top right of the page. So there should be basically a spine here in the center. And you do the same thing on the other side to create a structure. Then basically you already can decide where the text needs to go, because it touches 3 of those points. And then you get basically, if you think in units, and this is 2 units, 3 units, 4 units, 6 units. So the bottom margin is twice the size of the top margin, for instance, and the outside margin is twice the size of the spine margin. It's just geometry. It's a really simple way of quickly defining a text area. And then you, for instance, put text in there. That can still be in different sizes because you only defined margins and text area. You have not defined text sizes, the length of a line, etc., etc. So a slightly different version of this. So the same proportion as a page, and this is based on medieval principles of harmony, is basically you take the first step that we did and you add 2 lines to it. So from where these lines intersect, you draw a line to the top, and from there you draw a line to where they intersect on the other page. It gives you a new text area, which is slightly smaller, so the margins are bigger. And this is especially handy if you had to add a lot of footnotes, for instance. You know, in some text there were lots of notes. So still doesn't define the size of the text, the line length, etc., etc. But it helps you to organize, let's say, the composition on the page. So the second, and this is where we'll quickly go into InDesign, is a modular grid. And there's a lot of options how to design this, but we'll focus on how the type defines the grid and how the grid defines the type. That's 2 different approaches. Both of them are fine and correct, but I think one of them makes a little bit more sense, but that's my personal opinion, because both of them work. So when type defines the grid, which basically means the design defines the grid. So you first design something, you sketch. That's also what you've been doing so far. For instance, in this assignment, you make all these sketches, you try out different things based on, you know, an idea that you have, but also based on aesthetical preferences, on, you know, on things you've seen, on things you would like to reference, etc., etc. And then at some point you go more, you start making decisions, you go more in depth, you become more precise. So your design starts defining or starts basically asking you a specific question. Like, I need this from you. You know, I need to now know where to put the page number. That's kind of your document is starting to ask that, you know? So you try all these different things, really nice. Now make a decision. Where are you going to put me? And where are you going to put me? And how many options do I have? You know, am I always in the same spot or can I move around? Like, you start becoming more precise. So the design defines the grid, or the type defines the grid. Are you still okay? Because it's 50 minutes in, but like 40 minutes of talking, basically. Because otherwise I'll go into InDesign. Okay.
I'm still okay. I don't know if everybody else is. But... Yeah, me too.
Okay. I'm also good.
Okay, great. So this, what helps is if you pick an approximate page size. Sometimes you need a specific page size, but let's say for now I pick an approximate one, and I'll show you why. You choose a typeface and do a lot of tests with sizes. So aside from the design itself, you also really go more in depth with the type size. So if you would have been in a regular class, in a regular situation, I would have asked you for this week, for instance, to do a lot of size tests. To try and be really specific, because also there you want to become more specific, because at some point you're going to decide on the actual size of the typeface, for instance, that you're going to use, and the actual typeface and the actual you know, space between the lines, space between the words, etc., etc. So, you know, tracking, etc. And then we base everything on the body typeface and the leading. So we use the leading as a unit. So for instance, these are things that I make. I mean, they're not necessarily designed, but just to test sizes. You know, so for instance, first, you know, I do a lot of sketching. Then at some point I decide, you know, I think my body type size and typeface should be somewhere around this, you know? So for instance, 9.6 on 12. So 9.6 type size, point size on a 12-point leading with a tracking of 0. This typeface is called Elizabeth. By the way, it was designed by a Typomedia graduate. And we worked on this. He said it was finished. when I started using it for a project, but it wasn't. So, which was actually really nice. I mean, it was almost finished, but not entirely. So we could talk about some things and also about things like, kerning. So 9.6 on 12. What happens 9.6 on 12 with a tracking of +10, with a tracking of +20, with a tracking of -10. So start going into detail a bit more. And of course, this is all printed because this is for a printed book. 9.4 on 12, 9.2 on 12, 9 on 12. So then I think, for instance, 9, I think is too small of a type size. Or depending on how you look at it, the leading is too large for the type size. I do all these tests, 9.8. So what happens when it's slightly bigger? 10 on 12, and I think it's a bit too cramped with a tracking of +5. How does it work in caps? So in uppercases, 38.4 on 48, 19.2 and 24. So I always add the leading and the type size when I make these documents, because at some point I might have printed, like 20 of these sheets or 50 or whatever amount. And I know I like one, but I forgot which one it is, and I did not save my document or did not save it properly. So, I always put it in the document. Same for another typeface. This one's called, I think this was Atlas Grotesque, which is designed by Susanna and Kai. Basically, same thing. Do all these different tests. More tests. So, and I print all of this. And you can really tell the difference. Like sometimes it's really difficult to see it on a screen, but when you print it, when you laser print it, and you look at the text, then at some point you really start noticing the differences of like +5 or -5 in tracking, or like 1/10 of a point in type size. Like you really start seeing those things, or at least I think you start seeing those things. Maybe you don't, and you're just going crazy, but that's fine as well. So different sizes for headings, for instance, for numbers, etc., etc. So again, this is 40-point type size on a 42-point leading with a tracking of -5, 28.8 on 36 leading with a tracking of -20. Just seeing how do these typefaces behave. So at some point I decide. And after sketching, I decided on the following specs. For instance, for now, my page size is 170 by 240 millimeters, which is basically the most optimal book size. So a lot of the design books that you'll see, let's say mid-sized design books, are within the 17 by 24 centimeter range. And this is because it's the most economic format when you do offset printing. Because on a sheet size of 102 by 72 centimeters, you could get a full signature of 16 out of this. Anyway, typeface, solid regular, that's also used in this presentation. Type size is 11.3 points on a tracking of 13.2 points, leading, with a tracking of 7, +7. So this seems random, but it's not. This is all tested, and I printed this, I looked at it, this is what I want to use as a designer. Of course, this could also be 11 on 13 or whatever, but I prefer this for this example, and for this typeface and this size for this medium. So let's go to InDesign. So does everyone see my InDesign now?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Just checking. So in InDesign, let's start a new document. So Command N, new document. I will do web for now, because then we can use RGB colors. If we do print, then it adds CMYK colors, and they just look a bit less bright. So let's say we'll still do millimeters and units, which is a bit weird for screen size, but that's fine. So we discussed a width of 170 millimeters, a height of 240 millimeters. For now, I mean, let's do 3 pages so that there's at least a spread in the document. I'm not adding any columns. I'll turn the gutter to 0. I don't want any margins, so also 0, everything else is 0. And I create a new document. And I forgot to turn on spreads. So I'll make a new document because we need spreads. KABK, grid, test, spreads. For web. Always good to repeat stuff, right? Facing pages. No margins. Yeah, now we have a spread. So, typeface, right? So let's just add a text box. I fill it with some placeholder text, and I change this into favorite, pro, book, 13 point. What did we decide? 11.3 points on 13.2 point leading, the tracking of 7. So this, let's say, is the type size that we're going for. This is the basis of our grid. So this is the body text, typeface, type size, etc. No, there's still minor things that we could change later, but nothing really big, and especially not the leading. So if, for instance, now I think, I'm not so sure, I actually think I prefer like 11.4, that's still fine, or 11.5, but we're not going to change the leading anymore because we're going to use that unit. So if you press, usually if you press W, it will show the margins. It will show the lines of the columns, for instance. But we did not define any margins, so you see that the purple lines basically are just around the document. So we can view, if you go to View, Grids and Guides, you can, for instance, show the baseline grid, or you can do Alt-Command apostrophe. So this is the baseline grid that's in there. You can also show the document grid. So this is usually what you see when you see all those grids. This is just standard setting. This is really confusing and annoying, and it's not really going to make anyone happy. So usually most people ignore it, and actually often people also ignore this, but it really helps. So I'll leave the baseline grid on for now. So what I'll do is I'll go into the master page. So if I look at the pages panel, now I'm in the regular pages, but I want to change this in the master. So I'm just copy pasting the text here. And what we're going to do first is open the preferences of the document. So that's Command K. Or you can also do InDesign preferences, general, for instance, but Command K is quicker. And then we go to grids. So as you can see, the baseline grid is light blue. It's this grid that's on right now. It starts at 0 millimeter from the top of the page. It increments every 12 points. So that means that there's a leading unit of 12 points. And the view threshold is 75%. I'll just put the view threshold at 5%. So because I always want to see this baseline grid. And the increment, we're going to use the leading that we defined. So 13.2 PT. So in this one, this increment thinks in points. So I showed it before during the flyer assignment. that you can do calculations in all of these boxes, right? So you could also do increment every like 2 plus 5 points, for instance, and then it will make it 7. But it's important to define the unit. So increment thinks in points, so that's fine if you just put in 13.2 because it knows its points. But if you, in a lot of the other boxes, it thinks in millimeters because that's, you know, the ruler that we use for this document. Could have been pixels, could have been pica points, something else. So for now, 13.2 points, and we close it and we see that the grid baseline has changed. So this is really nice because now if we put this on it, I haven't aligned anything, but you see that the text and the grid, they now align. Kind of, you know, I mean, again, I haven't put them on like precisely, but just to quickly check. But something that annoys me to no end, like, you know, the thing that you start wars about is this margin at the bottom. Like, what the hell? So this is something you can accept. So my document size is 17 by 24. So what you can do, and what some people who are nerdy about this stuff do, is they start changing the increments so that they at some point line up. Or they take the height of the document and divide it by, you know, something so that eventually it ends up at an exact amount of lines, you know, so not like 24.3 lines or something, but just exactly this. But what you can also do is you can just basically cut this off. So one thing is you accept it, which might not be so bad, depending on how OCD you are, but might not be so bad, because one thing is that if you place something in the center of a page, for instance, exactly in the center, then it looks like it's falling. So you want to place something, you know, if you want to make something feel centered, like vertically centered, you want to place it a little bit higher. And I'm not talking about a centimeter, but like a tiny bit. That's just optical correction. So this thing at the bottom is, I mean, it's really annoying me a lot. So what I do, I want to cut this off. So I basically measure it. I just press M. So, you know, so basically that's my rectangle tool, M, and I measure this thing. So now it says in the top, this is a height of 2.5 millimeters, right? So I know that this little sliver at the bottom is 2.5 millimeters high. I want to get rid of it. So what I do is basically I open my document setup, or Alt Command P. So Alt Command P. And I do height is 240 minus 2.5 millimeters. So I can just do the calculation in here, and I press OK, and this thing is gone. Heaven. So now it's gone. It also means that my yeah, exactly. But it means that now my document height is 237.5 millimeters, which I don't mind, but you know, that happens because maybe it can't. Maybe it has to be exactly 240 because, you know, it's a series that you're designing and all of the books, you know, should be the same size. Or maybe because it has to fit in a cassette that's already been made. Maybe, you know, blah, blah, blah. There could be all kinds of reasons why you could not do this. That means that you probably have to accept the little thing at the bottom, but I think it's just fun to cut it off. So we just did that. So we go back into, because this is only the baseline grid, we go back into the preferences, so Command K, go back to grids. We looked at the baseline grid. Now we are going to look at the document grid. Let me just quickly turn the document grid on, which is Command apostrophe. Grids, horizontal grid line. Now it says every 20 millimeters with a subdivision of 8. So every 20 millimeters there's a line, but it's this space of 20 by 20 is cut into 8 blocks, both vertically and horizontally. So I don't want that because I want a grid line every 13 point to PT. And here it's important to add the PT because this thing thinks in millimeters. So if I say 13.2, it thinks, okay, 13.2 millimeters, but I want 13.2 points because this is based on my text, my text size and my leading unit. I want no subdivisions. Same thing here, 13.2 PT, subdivision 1. And you see that it immediately changes this to millimeters. So apparently 13.2 points is the equivalent of 4.657 millimeters. So now you see that this is starting to align. But again, this is like an annoying little thing. Driving you crazy, of course. So basically gonna do the same thing, gonna zoom in. Now in my document grid, I'm going to measure this thing. And I see it has a width of 2.36 millimeters, which I just copy. I do Alt Command P, so I open my document setup. And now from the width, I subtract, I do 170 millimeters minus 2.36 millimeters. And now this thing is also gone. So now I have perfect squares in my grid, which makes me very happy. But I now have a page size of 167.64 millimeters and a height of 237.5 millimeters. So this happens to me a lot. And then I always get a phone call from the printer. Because the printer says, Rob, there's something going on in your document. I'm like, tell me. Well, your page size is 167.64 millimeters wide. I know. We cannot print this. We cannot bind this. We cannot cut this. Because the knife that they use to cut the paper is already 1 millimeter thick. So it cannot do tenths or hundredths of a millimeter. So they're like, yeah, so what should we do? Because this basically means it's going to be 167 or 168. So it's not going to be exactly 167.64. That's fine. Yeah, but you define this in your document because they, of course, have to, well, when they agree on taking the project, they have to do this according to the specifications that I ask them to do, because that's what I am or the client is paying for. So, if all of a sudden I say, it is really, really, really super important that this, 100th of a millimeter is exactly like this because it's a conceptual artwork. It's going to be exhibited at the Stegelijk, and it's really, really important. It cannot be 100th of a millimeter less or more. Then they are probably going to say no because they cannot do it technically. So then maybe you would laser it or like find another solution. So, but to me, it's important, or it can be important, that this thing is correct according to my grid. But it really depends, because of course I can also accept these, little, let's say, inconsistencies as well. But for now, I don't. So I just take them out. So, but now we only have squares. So we have no design yet. We still, I now know that I can put this somewhere. By the way, it can be nice to, in view grids and guides, say snap to document grid, and also click snap to guides. It helps you to position things so then it clicks to these lines instead of what you sometimes see, that you have stuff like this happening, where it doesn't exactly click to the grid. So if you say snap to grid, then it makes it easier just to snap it basically to the grid or to the guides. But it still doesn't say anything about the width of my columns or the spaces or like where I put things. Like, do I start the text here or here or here? Like, I don't know yet. So I need to define margins. So I'm still in my master, by the way, because if I define margins, so the things we did so far, they are, let's say, defined in the document setup. So that means for all pages of the document, it's using the same grid, using the same document and baseline grid, but the margins can be specific to a master. So you can make multiple masters, which I will show. So I'm still in my master, a master, and I want to add margins basically. So I click layout. By the way, it's important to have both of the pages selected. So if you just double click a master, because if you do one, so right now I've only selected the left page of my master, then it will only do the margins for the left page. So if I select both, it will do it for both. So when I click layout, margins and columns, then, and I click preview, make sure that it's clicked. Then I'm first going to add margins. So this again is in millimeters, but I'm using this 13.2 point unit, 13.2 PT again, because this thinks in millimeters and I'm thinking in points. I can of course also change my entire document to points, but and there's designers who do that. I think my typography teacher in my 4th year at KABK, he made all his documents in pica points, I think, because it was more precise and because it actually makes sense if everything is based on the type. But I still don't know exactly if you tell me, my document is blah blah points by blah blah points, then I think, can you please translate this to millimeters for me? So top margin, 13.2 points. And then you see, now it did it for all of them. I don't want that, but that's fine. So I'll just change these to 0. Only the top. You see that this purple line at the top has now moved 1 unit down. So this is my top margin line. I can do the same thing for instance, my outside margin, so 13.2 PT. And you see that now also 1 unit has been added here. So that means my outside margin is 1 unit of my leading, which is 13.2 points or 4.657 millimeters. I can of course now also just copy the millimeters. And I can start playing with this. So let's say I really like a small, like a really tiny top margin, like 4.5 millimeters, a little bit more. It's not super small, but not all printers would really like to work with margins that small. And especially when you go to like 2 millimeters, because if they make a little mistake in cutting, then you will see it immediately because there's, not a lot of margin, literally as well. Let's say my bottom margin, I want 4 times this. So what I could do is I could do 13.2 PT times, so asterisk 4. And then just go to the next box by pressing tab, and then it does a calculation for me. So I don't have to do all of this, using a calculator or like, just be a crazy savant mathematician. I can just do the InDesign can do the calculations for me. So that's 18.627 millimeters, and you can see at the bottom that's 4 grid units that now have been added. No, maybe I actually don't want this. Maybe I think 3 would have been better. I can also do this minus 13.2 PT, and it will just subtract 1 of the units. So I can even combine millimeters and points in the same calculations. That's not a problem. On the inside, I want, I don't know, maybe I want, 4 times 13.2 PT. So again, this is an example just. And on the outside, I want to do, I don't know, 3 times 13.2 PT. So now you can see that my margins have been defined. If I turn off my document grid and just show the baseline grid, then you see that the baseline grid and the margins, they align completely. If I add my document grid, you see that still all of it aligns. And if I only show my margin, then you don't see anything aligns, but all of these units are, based on each other. The margins use the same units. So this gives me a little bit more of a structure, because now I know the edges of my margins, but I still don't exactly know where to put stuff. Because maybe I have page numbers, I have columns, etc. So I also need columns. So I go back into layout, margins and columns, and say, I want to add columns. I don't know, I want to add a couple of columns. But I also have a gutter, because now this line basically cuts right through one of the units. So I want a gutter, so column space, of 13.2 pt, which now also means that my column, my gutter width is the same as my leading unit, as you know, my margin unit. I use the same unit for everything. But maybe I want 3 columns. Maybe I want 4 columns. Now it's starting to get more annoying because if I do 4 columns, now you see that 2 of the gutters actually cut through the units. Again, this is something I can accept if I want to, because still the width of the columns is the same. So the text, you know, the width of the text that I put in between or into those columns is the same, but it just looks messy. So what I can do is I could start playing with the inside and outside margin, for instance. That's an option. If I really need 4 columns and I'm super OCD and I don't want this to be cut, then what I could do is see what happens if my, I don't know, outside margin changes to 2 times 13.2 pt. Well, that kind of makes it worse because now all of them are not aligned. What happens if it's 1? Then they're aligned, which is really nice, but maybe I don't want this outside margin. So that's kind of like, you know, the play between those things. Maybe I really wanted that, you know, that like 3 unit outside margin, because 3 times 13.2 pt. So now again, it doesn't line up, but actually I want maybe 5 or 6. And lucky me, 6 columns actually fit this grid as well, and everything still aligns. So I'm now going to use this 16. So this would be, you know, margins and columns, margins, columns, and the baseline grid, margins, columns, baseline grid, and document grid, and everything aligns. The only thing is that my document has a slightly weird size, and then I will get a phone call from the printer or the binder. But that's fine because they are nice people, so they can call me. So how can we start working with this? Let's go. Now I'm out of my master, outside of my master, and I went to a normal page again because, as you know, everything that I put on my master, so let's say I put like a big red square on my master. I'll also now put it on all pages, so I cannot select it. I can click it free from the grid by clicking Command, Shift, and then click. I can unlock it from the grid and then I can move it. But if I now, let's say, add, you know, more pages, then it will always, you know, add the thing that's in my master to those pages if they are defined with an A master. I can, of course, also do another master. So I can, for instance, duplicate the master spread and say, I want this thing to let's say, let's just change the color. So my A master has a red square, my B master has a green square. Now I can also drag this over an existing A master. I'll say apply master to pages, apply B master, and it will change it. So now I have 2 different masters. One includes a red square, one includes a green square, for instance. But of course, in my B master, I could say, I'm changing the margins here. So in my B master, I'm changing my margins to 3 columns, for instance. So I can even change the name. So 3 calls and 6 calls, for instance. So if you work in a document that includes a lot of different sections or different types of content, it can be really nice to have a bunch of master pages so that you can quickly see, you know, either a difference in column grid, or maybe there's different elements on there. Maybe it's a different size, like etc. There's all kinds of stuff you can define in this master. Let me delete this. So this is my text, right? And my baseline text, or my body text, I mean. So let's turn this into a paragraph style. So I have my paragraph styles open on the right side. If you have it open, you can click Window, Styles, Paragraph Styles, and it opens basically this panel. And I just select the text, create new paragraph style. I will call it body 1 for now. If you have an external keyboard with a numerical keypad, then you can add shortcuts here, which is really, really nice. And especially if you maybe are like developing or suffering from RSI, for instance, or things like that, then it can really be really nice to work with shortcuts. So for instance, you can do shortcut Command 1. You can assign it, which means that I don't even have to click styles anymore. I can just go somewhere, put my cursor in the text and click Command 1, and it will know that it has to apply this paragraph style to it. So it's Favorite Pro in the font style book, or the book weight, size of 11.3 on a leading of 13.2 with a tracking of 7. The kerning is a matrix, not optical. And one thing that I'll do is I'll say align to grid, all lines, preview, and I will apply body 1 to this. So now you see that it's aligned to the baseline grid. Let me close the CC library. So now at least I know that if I have text, in multiple columns, for instance, that these texts, they will align. So as you can see, they are in the same, same grid, same baseline. And this is something that's really, nice. Because that means that if I'm working with spreads, but especially also with multiple pages, and they're printed and maybe the paper is a bit thin, or like in a newspaper, if the lines still align, if it doesn't become messy. So this baseline grid helps me, and as I said before, it takes the guessing out of design. I can still move this thing anywhere, move this paragraph or this text anywhere. But I don't have to guess, like, I think, kind of here. No, it's either on this baseline or on this baseline or on this baseline. But I can still decide where I put this, kind of. So it just helps me to make quicker decisions and to make this look more consistent. So this is now nice. Let me turn off the document grid and just keep the baseline grid on. So now I can really quickly test, for instance, different sizes or different columns. So what happens if I have, 3 times 2? What happens if I have? So I'm just copying this. So when you press, when you have something selected and you drag it while you press Alt, it duplicates it. So if I do Alt, so now I just press Alt, it just duplicates the thing that I am dragging. If I do Alt-Shift, it also keeps it on the same baseline. In this case, my object snaps to the baseline anyway, or aligns to the baseline anyway. But if I do this with, for instance, an illustration or a line, then I want to make sure that it's on exactly the same line, exactly the same height. So then I press Alt-Shift when I drag something. So I can start playing with different combinations. So I can really, really quickly make a combination of different columns if I want to. And of course, as I said before, let me just copy all of this. Doesn't mean that I have to fill up everything. I can of course decide to use different sizes or have different openings in my document. Or even have stuff like this going on. But still, it's all in the same system and the same baseline, the same column. So that means we are always looking for some kind of consistency. Our brains are trying to understand distances, trying to understand sizes and relations between things. So right now there's a relation between these things, which is really nice. But, by the way, are you still okay or in need of a break?
I'm still okay, but maybe I think in 5 or 10 minutes, like a coffee break. I don't know. Or now, I don't know.
Yeah, also about 5-10 minutes. Coffee break, coffee break.
Okay. That is completely fine. So the thing is, of course, that we are often using different sizes in a text. So if, let's say, let's turn off the baseline grid for now. Let's say we have a text and there's footnotes, for instance. So we have a body text, we have footnotes, we have headings, subtitles. How do we deal with this? So what you often see is, for instance, let's say, let's quickly fill this. Let's say you have a footnote or like just a note in the text, and you say, okay, I want this to be smaller than my text. Smaller than my text, so I'll just, I don't know, I'll make it smaller, and I'll, also make it a bit tighter because, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, this looks nice. Let's do something like this. So that's quite often, I think, how you're designing. The thing is that there's not a real relation now, because as you can see, this is not really connected to the grid anymore. I just put this somewhere. And also, if you zoom out, you see that especially if you squint your eyes, you see there's a different type of black, in terms of space. Also, if I zoom out further, then this seems a bit darker than a bigger text. If I put this, if I make the lettering even closer, or if I make the type size bigger, for instance, there's a different type of black. So, looking at it doesn't feel like they're connected. And maybe that's something you want, because it could be a decision, you see it really often in designs, where people are really playing with readability, legibility. Of course, you can do it, but sometimes it's really nice if these things actually are connected. So what you could do is, basically what you want is for the smaller text or the bigger text to click back to the grid every couple of lines. So let's say I will just like add some blah blah, body 1, and what I think is a really nice way of doing this is working with percentages. So if this is 100% and you want your text to be smaller, then maybe you want your text to be 75%, for instance. So if 100% is 11.3 on 13.2, then 75% of that, and I don't have to do the calculation myself, I can just click, like copy something, click it, and make it smaller, is 8.475 points type size on a 9.9 point leading. If you are clicking and you're thinking, I want my notes to be a little bit smaller than my body text, then you're for sure not going to end up accidentally on a size of 8.475 points, because you're going to probably do this in increments of a point, maybe half a point, but not really less. which is not necessarily a problem, but this, I know, this size, nice, let me delete this, is exactly 75% both in leading and in type size of my body text. So these things are clearly related. They're really, really clearly related. I can, of course, also do 70% or 80%. I can basically do anything because, you know, if I just copy this and I do, I don't know, like 61%, it will also do the calculation for me. 61%, however, is a bit more complicated, which I will show in a bit. So let's say this is our body 1 style. This should be a new style. This is maybe note 1. So I can just, you know, put my cursor in here, make a new paragraph style, call it a note 1, maybe command 2 as a shortcut. No, this, it already loaded it. I don't want to add this to a library. And I actually, if this is now, if you look at this, and let me just fill this with more text so that it becomes a bit more clear. If you look at this, is there anyone who sees a problem or something that you don't like about this?
I don't like the leading.
You don't mind the leading?
No, too much space for me.
Yeah, exactly. Because the leading is the same as the body text, right? It's still on this 13.2 point leading. But the type size is a lot smaller. So, you know, this might work, or I mean, I know because I made the decision. So for me, this works in this combination of type size and leading, but now it doesn't work anymore. I have the feeling that this paragraph, this block of text is falling apart. There's too much space. So what I can do is, you know, I made a paragraph style out of this, note 1. I can open the paragraph style and I can go to indents and spacing. And instead of align to grid, all lines, I change it to first line only. So first line only, and then you see it change immediately. So what happens now is you see that the first line of each paragraph, and the paragraph is ended by this paragraph break, right? So I have my hidden characters on, by the way, in case you haven't or you don't. It's really helpful to do type and then at the bottom show hidden characters, because then you see that here's a paragraph break. This tells me this is the end of a paragraph. And especially nice because if I want to, for instance, combine sizes. So if I want this paragraph to be small, and now I'm just using these shortcuts, I can do it super quickly, super easily. Same thing here. If I want here to have a combination of my body size and my note size, because it's different paragraphs, so I assume it's different types of content or different parts of a text, then I can do it like that. But if this is one note, and now you see that every first line of the paragraph, it clicks to the grid, it aligns to the grid, just like the baseline grid I use for the body. And then every fifth line, it clicks to the grid again. So it keeps this rhythm. So these are allowed to float in between the baselines a little bit, because I want the leading to be different, smaller, because the text is smaller. But I also don't want this thing to be completely separate from this baseline grid, because I want consistency and harmony. So every fifth line, it clicks back to the grid. Now, one problem is if your notes, in this case, or smaller text, include a lot of paragraph breaks, then basically what it does now is it says, the paragraph is ending here, end of paragraph, new paragraph, click the first line to the grid. So, but now there's a weird space in between them. I might not want this because this might be a new paragraph, but I don't want to have this big space in between. So what I can do is I can, for instance, one thing I can do is change or replace this paragraph break for a line break, which is a shift enter. So now we'll just continue. It will just see this as one paragraph. And I can, of course, decide to, for instance, I don't know, add a tab, for instance, to show that this is a new paragraph. What I can also do is add another line break and say, okay, another line break. In this case, then it clicks back to the grid just because it should be on the grid, because if I add text here, right, so the rhythm is still the same. So, the actual line break wouldn't have been a problem because it would have clicked to the same position if I, would have used an enter, like an actual break. But maybe I want to do this to show that the new paragraph is starting. But let's say, now the space will be even bigger. And a line break would be like this. So you can see the difference. So you can play with line breaks and paragraph breaks. The only thing is, and this is just, in all of InDesign, a paragraph break and a line break are not the same. If you apply a paragraph style to something, then it applies it until the end of the paragraph. So until the next paragraph break. So this is a paragraph break. That means that any style I apply to this. So if I decide that this has to be body 1, it will only do it for this paragraph until here, and then here I can apply a different style. If I want to change one word, for instance, then I do a character style, or one letter, or one sentence, because it only applies to the things I select, not to an entire paragraph, for instance. So, and this works the same way, same the other way. So let's say that we also need a title. So I can, I don't know, this is an amazing title. And of course, in like true minimalist fashion, I can decide, to do everything in the same size, for instance, also the titles, and to just show that it's a title by adding space. Or I can, of course, now it makes it really easy to move things around, to use the different column lines, for instance, use my grid basically. I can add tabs here. I will come back to tabs in a minute. But of course, maybe I want to have a bigger title. So maybe I want to, let's say I'm using this for subtitles. Let me play with this a little bit. So maybe this is like a paragraph title, or it can also be something like this. Or I can like underline it. I can capitalize it. Make it uppercases, which is Command Shift K. So K turns lowercases into uppercases. So this is something I could do, but maybe I also want a bigger title. So I basically could do the same thing that I did for the smaller text, but now I make it bigger. So I select this, and I make this, I don't know, 175%, for instance. And it still clicks to the grid because it copies this from the previous style. But because this type size is now bigger than my leading, it doesn't fit the first line. So if I want it on the first line, I need to move it up a bit. And then you see that it basically becomes like it crosses my margins. Maybe I don't think it's a problem. Maybe I do. That's a design decision, I think. That's an amazing title. But what happens now is the same thing. I find this distance a bit too big. And that's because this is a 23.1 point leading, but because it clicks to the grid, because I defined that in my style, so let's turn this into a new style and do, I don't know, title 1, Command 3 as a shortcut. It has a size of 19.775 kt, and again, something you probably would not accidentally do or or type in. This is something you do because you've calculated it. With a leading of 23.1, kind of the same thing. But my grid unit is 13.2 points. So 26.4 would be 2 lines. So this is a little bit less than 2 lines. So my distance is too big. So I can do the same thing here. I can go to indents and spacing, and instead of align all lines to the grid, I do the first line only. And I align it here. And you can see that now it clicks to the grid. And let me see what happens if I fill it with a bit more text. Then also every 5th line, it clicks back basically like here. So if I add a lot of placeholder text here, then you can see that now it starts clicking back. I can of course decide to do a title here. This can also be a caption or something else. It just is a different element or a quote or anything you want. As you can see, having a system like this, so let's copy this. Let's just copy the spread. Just give me a second and then we'll do a break. So if you let's say really quickly want to design some stuff. And you want to test a couple of things. Maybe you want, I don't know, to play with like indents and outdents. Maybe you have some notes that you want to add. Maybe you sometimes add notes on multiple sides. So I'm just moving some stuff around, just because we can. I always really enjoy this part where at some point, I've done a basic design for something and then decided that, that I like it, that I think it's worth, making it a bit more precise and really, start putting it in production, let's say. Delete this, it's annoying. And then starting to play around with the different possibilities of things. Like for instance, when you're doing a magazine or you're doing like a catalog or something like that. Because as you can see, it's now so easy to just, start playing with different possibilities for layouts. And it takes you literally like a couple minutes to just quickly try something. And I can still decide to move it. I can still decide that I, maybe want to, like do different things, like have 2 columns, I don't know, maybe I actually want even different like note sizes. Maybe I have notes, or maybe, I don't know, let's say these are, note numbers that I put in there. So this is interesting again, because now, of course, I added paragraph breaks. I can just really quickly play with, with stuff like this. and really quickly make a layout and just play around. And the more you play with this, I mean, it's just so easy to, maybe there's like, I don't know, there's also A, B, C or something, I don't know. So if I have a complicated structure of content, or I want to do like reference lists, or, I don't know, kind of encyclopedic things, you can do like word, word, word. And you can just, like, it's so simple to play with everything, and to play with, even with different alignments to, make everything centered, for instance, and to really play with this, or to do some things left align, something center. I mean, there's just so many possibilities. And now I can still decide, that actually I want these to be big, or I want these to be big, and I want these to be bigger, for instance. And of course I have to tweak a couple of things here and there, and they might not always align because they use different lettings. But I can definitely play with this much easier than if I have to guess all the time. So I think that is, one important thing. If you have to guess all the time, like what, maybe this size, maybe this typeface, maybe this, tracking, etc., etc. Maybe, I put this here, and this could be there, and this could be there. It's going to be super messy. And now you see how quickly, you can produce. And I've only defined 3 paragraph styles, only a body, a note, and a title. How quickly you can now design a grid, basically, or design using a grid. So one thing that I think it's necessary to also show before we take a break is tabs, because now basically the document unit or the document grid comes back into play. So I'll turn that back on. So Command apostrophe, or view grids and guides, show baseline grid. So you see that now this tab doesn't have anything to do with the unit. It's just a standard tab size that's in InDesign. So this is something that I can define in my style. So in my paragraph style, body 1, in this case, I just open it. So by double clicking on it, I go to tabs, and in X, I type 13.2 PT, and you immediately see a change if you click preview on. So now you see that one grid unit is now my tab space. And I can also do calculations here. I can do ×2, for instance, it's 2 units. Maybe I like this because it's exactly the center of one of the columns, right? The column is 4 units with 1 unit around it. So now in the center of the column is where the tab starts and ends. So again, it creates this line that I could also even use if I want to for instance, my notes, because maybe actually instead of working with a 6-column grid, I want to work with an even more refined one. The thing is that if I now decide, because that is of course a possibility, let me turn off the document grid for a bit. If I now say, actually during designing, because I think that's really important. When you're doing production, you're still designing. So let's say a lot of design studios, they often charge different rates for different parts of the process. So they charge differently for concept or for basic designs, for the starting point basically, and the basic aesthetic. They design, or they charge more than for production, So let's say for designing the general design of this publication, they would charge X amount, and then for actually doing every page, assuming that the pages are mostly the same, they charge a lot less, because otherwise a book, for instance, would become really, really expensive really quickly. Because if you charge, I don't know, let's say 100 euros per page, and you do a 400-page book, and then you charge for the basic design, you charge for, I don't know, project management, for presentations, for like whatever, a book really quickly becomes way too expensive for most publishers and artists to afford. Plus, it's also not fair because you do spend more time on deciding on all of these things, because as you can see now, you can quite quickly make pages. And these pages are still semi-complicated with, lots of columns, but there will be lots of pages with just text and one note or not even a note. Anyway, at the same time, I think it was interesting. There's this book called Talks About Money, and it was made at the Rietveld Academy, I don't know, like 10 years ago maybe. It was a series of books made by students talking about the part of the design discipline. So one was, difficult clients, one was talks about money, one was school assignments. And what I thought was interesting in the talks about money was all anonymous, but you could kind of figure out who was saying what. So it was all teachers that were interviewed. And I think, for instance, Experimental Jet Set, they said that they charge the same, which also really fits their approach. They charge the same for everything, kind of. I don't know if it's still the same, but I wouldn't be surprised. Because they say, it doesn't matter if you're like talking or presenting or thinking or sketching or you're doing production, you still make design decisions all the time, which I think is actually true. I mean, I think we all know, we've all experienced that, 5 minutes before finishing a project, you still decide to change the typeface for all your title pages, or you still decide to change your colors. And that's actually, that can be a really big change or really important change. So let's say you design this 6-column grid, with like all the things around it. And during the design, you actually start thinking like, I don't want the notes to be in these 2 columns. I want them to be 1.5 column, because I like the way they like the horizontal rhythm, let's say, how it changes. So if I move this back a bit, I set the timer. I have to. I think this is actually more interesting because it aligns with the tabs. I'm noticing that there's a lot of tabs, a lot of starts of paragraphs using tabs in my document, and I actually think it's really nice if my notes would align with this instead of doing this, which of course there's still some contrast, but I think this contrast is more interesting. But that means that you're kind of in a way ignoring part of your own grid. So now you could of course say that means I have to turn this into 12 columns, because now all my columns are going to split in half. But of course it's not as simple as that, because it's columns plus gutters. So if I now would change this into from 6 to 12, you can immediately see it doesn't align because the gutters don't align. So that means I have to think about my gutters in a different way, like recalculate them. But it also means that every page in this master, at least, is going to have this amount of columns in it, where the column space or the gutter and the column width are almost identical, or at least they're very close to each other. It's 1 unit and 2 units, kind of. That is super annoying to design, because this actually will make it, you will make more mistakes probably. So I don't want that. So what I can do, of course, is just decide. I can either like add, for instance, a guideline. I can add it to my master page so that it's always there. Maybe I don't. I can also make this a part of a paragraph style. So I can also say, I want this thing, so I'm going to put this in 2 columns. But now, I already did 300 pages of my book, and now I make the decision to actually change it into this, but I don't want to go through 200 pages again or 400 pages again. I want to do all of this at once. You can also now go into your paragraph style, into the indents and spacing, and say left indent 13.2 pt times 2. And then, it adds basically this. so basically this now has been added to all of the notes, and you see it here as well. So of course this has consequences for my document. It means that these columns of notes are going to be longer because the lines are a lot shorter. But I can totally do it. And I can, maybe it's not a problem at all because I have enough space and I don't have to click every note box, let's say again, text box again to change it. So now we've, basically made a grid. We did a document grid, a column grid, margins. We defined all based on the leading, the body size and on the leading mostly. We now have smaller text, so notes, let's say. We have titles or captions or whatever you would like to use this for. And we already established that we can even make the grid more, let's say, smaller or more precise to make to add subdivisions, kind of, without really changing the complexity of my starting point of the underlying grid, but to kind of add some tricks that don't make it overly complicated to this grid. And it seems like this is a good moment to take a short break. So should we do 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, cool.
Okay, so let's say we looked at a couple of things like regarding paragraph styles. So maybe it would be nice to go a little bit more in depth when it comes to styles. So if we just look at the body text, for instance, and we open the paragraph style body 1, then there's a lot of different options. And I think it's best to play with them a little bit because there's things that, all of them, of course, it's a layout production program. So all of these things are there for a reason, are there because people need them, are because they really speed up your process. So some things are options or functionalities that you maybe do not use a lot, or that you use in different ways, but you could actually do in a paragraph style. And then some things are, let's say, more fundamental, I think, that you kind of always do. So just going through them, of course, the basic character formats, you already define them. The size, the style or weight, tracking, etc., etc. So in the advanced formats, you could decide to, for instance, do a baseline shift. So I showed this in the flyer assignment, for instance. If you want things to shift from the baseline, so you want a certain element to be a little bit above or a little bit below the baseline, instead of selecting it. Wait, let me just show baseline. So if you want this entire thing to shift from the baseline by 2 points, for instance, then you can just do it in a paragraph style as well. So instead of having to go into your document and say, actually, I think, for instance, with these titles, right? I showed that this title extends a little bit over the top. If I find this really annoying, then I could decide to make this title, like slightly smaller, for instance, so, that it fits within. That's something I would actually recommend other than doing a baseline shift. But let's say you would like to do a baseline shift, then in the advanced character formats, you could do the baseline shift to like -0.8 or something, so that it touches the top margin. But that, of course, also means that it does not touch the baseline anymore. That's something I think personally is a bigger problem on the scale of InDesign and typography problems, I would much rather have this thing be on the baseline but extend over the margin a little bit than be it, touching the top margin but not on the baseline. But I could imagine that there's maybe times when you would actually use this, but I generally don't really use this in a paragraph style. You can skew, so this is not the same as a cursive or an italic, of course, because this is a forced italic, basically. But of course, you could play with this, and you could play with this in many different ways, which can be really fun. I mean, maybe some of the type purists, would start, getting seizures when seeing this. But it could be really fun to explore. I personally think, this cliche of, you have to know the rules before you break them. Yes, it's really important, I think, to understand rules or understand, actual research and experience, that has been done when it comes to readability, when it comes to, hierarchy and consistency and harmony and things like that. But at the same time, you're also a designer, so you can, also throw all of it overboard and make different decisions, which I think is super important. So in the indents and spacing, so I will go to, I was in the title style, I will go back to the body style and zoom out a little bit. So in the indents and spacing, so you can change the alignment quickly, right? You can decide that all of the text should be aligned, for instance, or centered. I mean, the thing is that in this body style, you can see it in the general tab. It's based on nothing, next style, same style, blah, blah, blah. But if I go into another style, so let's say I go into Node, so these styles that are based on the body style, because I copied it and then changed it and turn it into a new one, you see that it's based on body one. So my Node style is based on my body style. And so they're linked. What's really nice about it is if I decide to change my body typeface, for instance, or my body weight, it might also change the Node style, so that I don't have to click open, like 20 different styles or paragraph styles and change them. They're connected. The problem is also that if I now decide, what I was just doing, to center all of my body text, so center align, it now also center aligns everything that's linked to it. So maybe I don't want that. So I can decide to not have it connected, which I can just change in the styles or not. So I will just leave it at left. You can balance ragged lines. So this on the right side of the text is called a rag. So, and you see if you do left flush or left align text, that this is uneven. And you want to optimize this. So you want to optimize hyphenation. It's called ragging. So there's different approaches to ragging. Some people, let's say for instance, Switzerland, something you see really often is Flattersatz, which is like the wings of a bird. So they do short line, long line, for instance, and it looks a little bit weird. You can look it up. I'll post an image in the channel. It's also really nice, and it's very difficult to do. Of course, as fits. That's Swiss design. It's really, you need a lot of practice to do it well, and it takes a lot of time. But it can be really nice. What we tend to do really often when we left align text is to try and make, let's say the curves of this rag a bit more even, because you could of course do, full justify. The horror, because you get all these rivers of white, and you don't want the rivers of white because they are annoying to read. They make it really inconsistent to read. They make it difficult to read the text. And of course, again, if you're thinking about a flyer or a really conceptual design, then maybe it's not really a problem. But if you're going to typeset a really, really long text, and one of the goals is for people to read it, which doesn't have to mean that it should be boring. It can still be super interesting and really amazingly designed, but also nice and easy to read, or seem very trustworthy, for instance. Maybe it's an important document and it's a school book, or it's a report. and you don't want people to think, like, whose mom designed this, but then you want them to think, okay, this is like proper design. Then you need to do a lot of manual adjustments when you fully justify things. You could, of course, left justify, that makes it a bit better, but you'll still have to go into the text, also depending on the width of the columns. So the more narrow the columns, the more of these rivers you'll get. So I would not do it unless you're prepared to really go into the text and change some stuff by hand. So left justify. But what you can do is balance ragged lines. So what it now does is it tries to make a better rag. So if I turn this off, it actually extends all the way to the end of the column, to the edge of the column. Balance ragged lines means that the balance might be better, but you see that it's now weird. So it looks more evenly, but it never really touches the edge of my column. So now my space between the columns, for instance, or between the text and the margin, changes, which maybe is also not something I want. So this is really something depending on your settings, on your sizes, etc., if you want to balance ragged lines. I would not necessarily do it. So left indent, I showed before, right? You can say this entire text needs left indent, for instance, for like a unit. You can do that for notes, for anything. You can decide to indent the first line. So what you see often, the first line of a text, but it means the first line of the paragraph. And usually you don't start with the first line, like the first line of the paragraph. So this one, you would not necessarily do an indent, but you would do the second, like the first consecutive paragraph, but not the first one. But this, because everything is connected, now also does the same for the title, for instance. So you don't necessarily want that. So it's just something to think about. Space before, maybe I want to have a bit of space between paragraphs. So what it does now is I can add, for instance, a millimeter of space, but because everything is on a grid, it just means that it will click to the next grid line. So this 1 millimeter turns into, 1 millimeter, or at least 13.2 points, which was 4.6 something millimeters, right? So then you maybe change your alignment. So if you click things off the grid and you say nothing aligns to the grid, and I want one space before, then now you actually have the 4 millimeter or the 3 millimeter. The moment you click things back to the grid, that changes. So you can do the same thing on the right side, like a right indent, a last indent, or a space after. Maybe you always want to have like an extra space at the end of a paragraph, etc., etc. So tabs, we showed you can add multiple tabs because maybe there's 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 tabs because you're doing, I don't know, like a series of rows of numbers, for instance. What I think is actually a nice one, and that a lot of people do by hand, but you can do in a paragraph style, is the paragraph rules. So what you can define is a rule above or rule below, which basically means a line above or a line below. So you can do a rule below, rule on. So now it adds a line at the end of your paragraph. You can specify the weight. So maybe it's 0.5 point, for instance. And I don't know, you make it red. And you define if it has the width of the column or the text. So do you want to actually show, let's say, the column grid, or should it just align with the text that it underlines? So the last line, basically, which could be a really short one or could be a long one. Let's say the column, and you can do an indent. So you can start with, for instance, if you want to, a left indent of 1 grid unit. That's a possibility, but anything really you want. You could, do dashed lines or dotted lines. You could add tints. So maybe this line is not 100% of the color, but it's like a 10%, black or something, or 10% red in this case. And you can offset it, which means it's kind of a baseline shift. So you can, higher or lower. So what's the distance between the line and the element that it underlines? So maybe that is 0.5 millimeters, for instance, etc. So you can play with that. And something that's nice I can even decide to overprint the stroke. So maybe this is on top of another object. Maybe this is on top of a background color, on top of an image. You can decide that this stroke, so this line, needs to be overprinted. You know, like we looked at in the previous assignment, where the colors start mixing. So you can actually even play with these things. You can do at the same time. So in this drop-down menu, you can also do the rule above. And you can kind of do the same. Let's turn this document into something super pretty.
I have a small question.
Yes.
Can we overprint text one on top of each other if it's different colors?
Yeah, you can, but it's just different layers of text. But yeah, you can.
Okay, so I need to put text in different layers and then to put like overprint, because
Yeah.
I've tried and it didn't work.
Yeah, because the text is not an object yet. So then I think you need to first turn the text into an object.
Okay, okay.
And then overprint it.
Thank you.
So you can do the same thing for paragraph border. So you can actually add borders around paragraphs. You can even decide the distance from the top, bottom, left, and right, the type. You know, if it overprints, the gap tint. So if you, for instance, do dots around, and let's make the dots a bit bigger, then the gap is a space between the dots. So maybe I want those to be blue and overprinted and 50% with a different join. So that's the corners. I can even change the corners. Oh my God, InDesign is the best. So corner size and shape. So as you can see, you can really play also with different offsets, etc., etc. So of course now it all becomes a bit messy, but you can see that you can change corners. You can add a gap color, you can use different lines, etc. To make it even more pretty, you can do paragraph shading. So you can, this is something you see in magazines a lot, for instance, where you actually have a color behind the text block. You don't always want to select it, maybe you want to automate this, right? To already have this set up so that the spaces are always the same everywhere. And it always fits, you know, has the same margins, for instance, and the same corner sizes and shapes. So, you know, let's, I don't know, add a green overprinted thing. I still want to do corners. Probably won't really see anything anymore now, but that's fine. Oh yeah, so you see it here. So in the top left of this little gem, you can see how you can basically butcher text frames using paragraph styles as well. So I'm just going to turn this off for now because it hurts a little bit. And the rule below as well. So hyphenation, because I think that is the more fundamental one. So if you do hyphenation, first of all, you need to make sure that you are using the right language. So I really often notice that people do hyphenation settings for instance, a Dutch text with language set to English. So first of all, you want to check that. And that's something you can do in the advanced character formats, language, English USA, or UK, or like whatever language you are designing for, because the hyphenation will be different. Also, languages have different lengths, different types of words, longer words, shorter words, more, there are different characters, but also just different rules. So in the hyphenation, you can decide to not hyphenate at all, of course, the text, which sometimes is fine, but it can create an inconsistent rag. So if you do hyphenation, I generally, so you basically you have to choose between better spacing. So more consistent rag or fewer hyphens, because you don't want a lot of hyphens in your text. The more narrow your columns, the more hyphens you'll probably get, because there's less space to hyphenate or less space to put the words in. So we'll hyphenate more often. So something I always turn off is hyphenate last word. I don't want the last word of my paragraph to be hyphenated, because that means I could end up with, you know, like a 3-letter part of a word at the end of my paragraph. So I always want to keep them together. I also don't want to hyphenate across a column, because that means that if I have text in multiple columns, then it can like hyphenate a word at the bottom of the first column and continue it at the top of the second column. I don't want words to be broken in between columns. So within one column, it's fine, but not across the column. And then what I personally do is I always do after 3 letters and before 3 letters, because I don't want all of these short hyphenated words with just, you know, ending at en, for instance, or ed or something like that. I think that's really inconsistent. And the hyphen limit is the amount of hyphens in your paragraph. So if you have really long paragraphs, like long text, then maybe you're okay with having like, you know, 6 hyphenated words in your paragraph. If you have short paragraphs, you maybe only want, you know, 1 or 2. If you have paragraphs of 4 or 5 lines, then maybe you only want 1 or 2 hyphens in there. So, and this is really something that depends on the text and how it's written, how it's formatted, but also on the design, like how wide are your columns, etc., etc. So this is something to test also in the context of your own design. So this is not like a general rule that you always have to do. This really is based on what you need. Justification is where you define, for instance, the word spacing and the margins for word spacing. Again, this is also something that largely depends on the typeface, because some typefaces are spaced more widely or more narrowly, more tightly. What I often do is, or basically always do, except for a few maybe exceptions, is I make the word spacing smaller. So I change this to, for instance, like 70%, I don't know, like 90% and 100%. So that means it will try, so the algorithm will try to, you know, decrease the word spacing to 90%, but it has a margin in between 70 and 100. I can also, of course, make this margin much more narrow by doing, you know, 85, 90, 95, for instance. That also means that I give InDesign less room to interpret and to make decisions. Letter spacing. So this, if you have a lot of text and you have an inconsistent rag, for instance, then you want to play with letter spacing also a bit. So how much margin are you giving InDesign to play with letter spacing? So of course you define something, you define a tracking, for instance, and there's kerning in the typeface, but maybe sometimes, and especially if you do a lot of things by hand, and maybe you noticed during the flyer assignment sometimes, or in other projects, sometimes changing the kerning by, or the tracking by 1 point changes the entire layout or like the entire rag of your text. So you can, for instance, do letter spacing, let's say in between minus and plus 1. This is also something to try. Sometimes you don't see a difference at all, sometimes you do. Again, it depends on text size, amount of text, column width. All of these things are combined. Glyph scaling means how much space would you give InDesign to change the size of the glyphs, of the characters. So if InDesign thinks, like, if I make this word 1% smaller, or this glyph, you know, a combination of glyphs 1% smaller, it would actually fit on the line. So this is a margin that you can play with. So if you say, you know, glyph scaling, I don't know, minimum 40%, 50 is the minimum, desired is 60, then you see immediately that it now starts to scale, because it will just make it easier to flow this text nicely, to rag it nicely. So this again is something you can play with. You know, because maybe you actually want this aesthetic. Of course, it's, you know, butchering the typeface, but maybe that's part of your idea. Maybe that's something you're testing in your paragraph style. So if desired is 100, because you know, basically you don't necessarily want to change anything about the glyphs. But let's say if you say, okay, I will give the InDesign a margin between, you know, 98% and 102%. If you do this at a, you know, you probably won't notice, because 2% difference of a typeface that is maybe, you know, let's say 8 points in size, that's not a lot. So chances are that you wouldn't see the difference. Chances are that you do see the difference. It really depends on your design. Also depends on, you know, your experience. I mean, I can imagine that, you know, trained type designers, people like Frank or Marina, that they could spot these tinier differences than most other designers, or people who do not also design type, for instance, but maybe not. So it's a margin that you can define. You can, of course, add lists as paragraph styles. You can do bulleted lists or numbered lists. The nice thing is, I mean, now I'm doing this in the context of, you know, text style, like a body style, but still, you can change the bullet character. There's a couple like predefined in there, but you can also add them. And then it opens all of the glyphs basically that are in this typeface, in this weight of this typeface. And I don't know, maybe I want to add like a couple things. I don't know. So now I can also use different characters, different symbols, if I want to. You know, I can do a text after. I can add a character style. So I could say, you know, if I want to change the color of this thing, for instance. So character style is basically what you define if you do not want to change a paragraph, but individual words or letters. So new character style list 1. I can also add a shortcut to it. I'm not going to change anything about the typeface because I don't want to, but I'm going to change the color, for instance, to magenta. And I'm going to add an underline of like, I don't know, something in RGB blue. And let's just keep it solid. So now I decided that my bullet character is not only a different character, or my bullet, my list symbol, but it also has a character style applied to it. And this character style tells this thing that it should be magenta and have a blue underline, for instance. So you can specify it. You can do indents. First lines left, you can add tabs. So there's a tab after it. So after this bullet, there's a tab space. That now is 2 units, but now that has changed because there's something before the tab space now. So maybe I need to like revisit this, because you now see that this is not the center of the paragraph anymore, or the column anymore. So I can do bullets. Of course, I can change the character color, the weight, and this is always a nice thing that I showed in the flyer assignment, is these stylistic sets, or for instance, different figure styles. So I could say that I want to apply set 1, which is a different A, for instance, different lowercase a, as you can see, to it. Something changed in set 5. And sometimes like a lot of sets only include, for instance, different numbers or like a couple of different characters. That's something you kind of have to just figure out. Maybe there's a /0 instead of a regular 0. Maybe there's alternates for anything. And of course, you can decide that everything needs to be underlined, which I would definitely recommend for an entire book. You know, but it's something that you can do. You just as well strike through. I mean, so there's a lot of these things, but I think what is always important is hyphenation and justification and tabs, I would say. just to align these things with your grid. So, okay, because we don't have a lot of time left, there's one thing that I first thought maybe I should show another time, but I actually think would be nice to show now. Because I've been getting, of course, questions, and you saw Lois's question, for instance, about the paragraph breaks, about using a text file and then having all these breaks in there, all these enters in there. So something that you could do, if you have a text file, you can place files, right? Like you can place images, you can also place text. So let's say we have this grid, right? This is a grid that we're going to use for the text. And I want to copy paste all of my text in a document. But if I do that and I have to click all these boxes and link all these boxes, and I have, 3 pages of text, that's fine. If I have 300 pages of text, that's super annoying. So you can flow text quickly, and there's a couple of tricks. So if you use a text file or an RTF, the upside is you'll probably be able to find it somewhere. The downside is they are easy to load, but you need to remove breaks manually. So if I place a file, so I do Command D, which is place. I can also go to File and then Place. And I have this text file, like an edited text file. I open it, and now you see it's loaded to my cursor. So anywhere I click or drag, so if I drag, it will put the text in there. You'll already see that there's lots of breaks in there. I answered Lois's question. There's a couple of tools, and Kashka also posted a link to a video of how to remove them. But now if I want to put more in there and I want to link, then I need to do this all the time, like guaranteed RSI. If I open the text file and it's loaded to my cursor, as you can see, and I click the edge of a column or the edge of my margins, it will at least add the frame, like put it in a frame in my text, in my column system. So I don't have to drag something, but I still have to click for the next and for the next, which is super annoying, I think, at least. So I go back a couple steps, still have this thing loaded to my file. So what I can do is I can, if I press Alt, so you see the cursor changing a bit. So now you see like text. If I press Alt, then you see this wavy arrow. If I now click, then it loads the first text frame, but it already loads let's say the text that's outside of it again to my cursor. So I don't have to click this red plus all the time. If I just do this, click, 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 and you can see now because it has a different style. Then I don't have to go in and click this red plus. I can just do Alt click, Alt click, Alt click, maybe decide to skip, like a frame here and there or a column here and there. That already saves me a lot of time. But let's show this thing again. I'm just showing different options because you might use different ones. If you do Alt, Shift, and click, so if I do Alt, so I have this text loaded to my cursor. If I do Alt, you see the wavy arrow. If I do Shift, Alt, then you see arrow pointed down. If I now click, it will add automatic text frames inside my columns for the entire spread. I still have to now go to make a new spread or add pages and do it there, but this saves me at least clicking, 12 times, which is nice, I would say. But what's even nicer is if you just press Shift, then you get a different wavy arrow. So Alt is this wavy arrow. I mean, it's now wavy arrow with parentheses around it. If I now click, then it has to think a little bit, because now what InDesign is doing is autoflowing my entire text and adding pages by itself. adding text to all of my columns, and creating new pages and adding the text to it until the end of the document, until the end of the text. So not my InDesign document, but the text. So this is now 135 pages of text that have been added automatically.
This is crazy.
Magic, magic.
Exactly, that saves a lot of time. So that is really nice. The problem is there's still all these breaks in it, and they are annoying. So if we just look at the structure of the breaks, let's say let me delete this so I can make this a bit wider. You know, because in the text files, the breaks are hard breaks. So what I'm looking for, there's a difference between, you know, one break or multiple breaks. For instance, before a chapter or before a title. So one break I probably don't want. I could replace that. Here it's two breaks. That probably means a new part of the paragraph, like a new paragraph basically. So what I can do is I can copy this, Command F, which is find change. I can just copy paste the paragraph sign, so which is this. I can just really like literally copy paste and it will know what it is. Change it to a space, and then I don't know, search the entire document. Sometimes it says selected word or selection or page, story, all documents that are open even. My document, change all. And it has to think a bit because that's 11,240 replacements that now have been made. This doesn't solve all of the problems, but it already helps because basically what you're looking for is patterns. You know, one paragraph break means probably I want to delete it because that should be a space in my design. Two paragraph breaks probably means it's an actual paragraph break. It should be a break. And maybe three or more means new chapter. So if I know that structure, then I know that I can delete all the single paragraph breaks and then I can keep the others. So now you see this. But it deleted more. It's still like reflowing, but because it now deleted all paragraph breaks and replaced them with spaces. So instead of doing one paragraph break, it just said every paragraph break character, replace it for a space. And that's not what I wanted. I wanted to only select the instances where there's one paragraph break. And that is something that you can also find by, for instance, making it like whole word or case sensitive or include locked layers. Like you can play with this a little bit. And I will show like the next time I will go into grep, which will make that even some of those things easier, but that's a different story. The thing is, let me go back to having just a couple pages. So if I don't want this and I can find an HTML file of my book, of my text, that's a lot easier because if I just go to the HTML page, basically, like you don't see it, but I have like a website open, you know, on Gutenberg project, for instance. I now have copied that text, so I just did Command A, Command C on that page. So it probably also selected all the images or other stuff that was on there. I can filter that later. And what I can now do is I just, you know, press T, I drag a text frame, for instance, because, and then I do Command V. So I paste it in there, and let me change the style a bit so that you can see part of it. Now, the problem is that I cannot place an HTML file. So I can copy text, I can place text files, Word documents, RTFs, but I cannot place HTML. And that's annoying because I wanted to place it because then I can do the same trick I just did. So kind of a workaround, and I don't think this is an official thing, but it works, is I basically copy all the text, I drag a text frame, I copy all of the text or paste all of the text in the text frame. Now I get this red plus. I don't want to go clicking a red plus, etc., etc. What I can do now is either, of course, press Shift and it will like continue doing this. What I can also do is I click the red plus, so that means all of the overflowing text is now loaded to my cursor. So it's loaded, so plus. Then I delete, because I have this text frame selected, I delete the text frame. And now all the text is, all of the text basically is overflowing because there's no text yet. And now I do the shift click or the alt shift click or the alt click, whatever I want. So let's say I do the shift click. So now it's gonna add pages. I think I did not select everything.
So Command A is to select everything, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now it basically should start flowing the text until the end of the entire document and like basically add it. So it's kind of a workaround, because the nice thing about the HTML file is that there's no, not all those short breaks in there. So that's a couple of tricks. I can post the shortcuts to this autoflowing. I can just also post them as text in the channel, so that you don't have to, go through this whole video, for instance, which maybe would be nice, along with some other things that maybe are nice to kind of be able to quickly refer to. And then actually the last thing I wanted to show, let me think. Yeah, because I said before that there's two ways of doing a grid, right? Or two ways I wanted to go into. So the first one was type or design defines the grid. The other one was the grid defines the design of the type. And I can really show that in 2 minutes. So that might seem like, Rob, why didn't you show that one first? Because if it's so much easier, then I want to know that one. The thing is that I personally think that in most cases, it's better to design your grid based on, or to make a grid based on your design, so that it fits your design and your ideas, instead of starting with the grid. But sometimes you do want to start with the grid. Like if you think about this Strelka identity, or about the school, like the school identity, both are super the same, of course, these squares, then that's a starting point for everything. So then maybe you actually, do want to start with a grid, and then, basically have the grid define the design instead of the other way around. But in most cases, that's not what you do. So what you could do, and I will do this really quickly in InDesign, is I'll make a new document, just like at the start. I'll make a web document, millimeters, exactly the same, like 240 by 170, facing pages, no margins. I go into the master. Let me turn on the baseline grid and the document grid. So this is exactly the same starting point, basically. So now when I go into the grid preferences, so Command K of this document, and I go to grids, instead of saying, increment every 13.2 points, for instance, I could say increment every, 2 millimeters. That's a smaller grid. That's, for instance, a grid that Kyle Martens uses a lot, I think. You can do the horizontal document grid. You can do grid line every 2 millimeters with no subdivisions, basically, 2 millimeters, no subdivisions. now you get this square grid again. It's really small, so maybe 2 millimeters is, for now, is maybe a bit too much. So maybe it should be, I don't know, 5 millimeter grid, which also means that I'll use this 5 millimeter unit for everything. In this case, because of the 5 millimeters or 2 millimeters, they fit this document size, right? So I don't have to be afraid that I don't have to cut off parts of the paper. I can just say, I have squares of 5 millimeters. And I go into margins and columns, say 5 millimeters at the top, 15 at the bottom, I don't know, 20 on the inside, 10 on the outside. You see it's adding, I'm using gutters of 5 millimeters. And then somewhere, at some point, they will align. Like here in the 6 columns, for instance. The problem is that now I don't have type yet. Maybe I have sketches, but now I have a grid, but no type yet. So that means that if I now still think about, using Favorite, because I wanted to use a typeface, Favorite Pro, regular, then I could do like 5 millimeter leading, but it doesn't really let me do that. So I have to start figuring stuff out. Maybe I have to like connect it to the baseline. I have to like figure out like how much should that be? Because if I want to click it to a 5 millimeter grid, that basically means I already know my leading for my body text, right? Because that's what this thing clicks to or aligns to. Let's change it to Favorite. I can still do the 7 point. So now I have to start tweaking what kind of size I think fits. So, I mean, it's just a different approach, but I think it's weird that you start sketching things and then find the typeface, a size, a leading that you really like, and then design a grid and then have to change your type size and your leading because your grid tells you to. Because now, of course, I could say, okay, well, if my leading is going to be the same, then I want to know what happens, when I do this. So I'm basically doing a new test document. So it's not a way of doing a grid. It works, but here the grid is a starting point as opposed to the design being the starting point or the typography being the starting point. So I personally think the other one makes more sense. And I know it's a lot of information. I mean, this is like 2.5 hours of listening to me like blah about grids. And I also do not expect anyone, that's also not something that you have to worry about, to be really skilled at making grids or to know how to do a grid after this. I mean, I never learned it in school even. And then a lot of the design schools, they actually don't really teach you how to make grids, or they just say, yeah, you can do margins and columns. And yeah, baseline is nice because you can align the text. But they don't really go into calculation, for instance, a bit. And I also understand why, because it can also be a bit daunting or it can even be annoying. But I think the grids are really there to help. And for some people, it works. For some people, it doesn't immediately. But at some point, if you going to design a lot of different things, you use grids in some like way, shape, or form. So I think it can actually be really helpful, especially if you have trouble making decisions. So I always, I really like basically what I, showed in the other document, that you can just do stuff like this, like, relatively quickly and do quick tests and see, hey, I have a different chapter with slightly different content. Maybe I'm going to start in a different, in a different column. Maybe I'm going to play with my notes slightly different in this section of the book, or whatever it is, space. Maybe I'm going to try different sizes here, like etc. etc. It just makes it a lot easier to do. So you can do grid based on type, or type defines grid basically, or grid defines type in a way. And I think that is enough for now.
I have one small question. Sorry, guys.
No, that's fine.
So can it be that each chapter have different grid, or it looks super random?
No, you can have a different grid. So as I showed in this other document, added different master pages. So for instance, a master page with 6 columns and one, for instance, with 3. And you can do all kinds of things, of course, with different margins. But the document grid and the baseline grid, they are the same for the document. So, so the entire file will have the same, let's say, smallest units. So this 13.2 points in this case. But on top of that, you can do different things, because you can decide to do different margins. Maybe you want like 3 times 13.2 margin at the top, and you want 2 columns, etc., etc. All those things are possible. Maybe you want like 10 times 13.2 PT on the outside. So all these things you can do, but the starting point is the same.
Thank you.
So welcome. Any other questions? I feel sorry for Marina. I actually feel sorry for you, but then also for Marina. Please be like energetic this afternoon. That would be nice.
I have a question about, like, not about this, but more about what we need to do for next week, because I kind of want to work on typography today. Can you already kind of say what we need to do or what we need to work on? Or
what do you think would be a good next step if you look at your own process?
I think what you did in the beginning, like testing with leading and different sizes, and work with that, and then maybe finding something you like, and then like making your grid.
Yeah, I think that could be a good next step, because if you have a, maybe let's say next week you have a kind of a grid, or maybe you have an entire grid, that makes it really easy to produce also more chapters. Makes it easier to design variations of chapters. So I think that could be a really good step. And you could even start flowing all of the text once you do that, because if you have made a grid, then flowing the text is now, you can do it rather quickly. And you can of course also flow it in different master pages. So if you have, you can flow parts of the text, for instance, in like an A master or B master or different columns. So you can also already start flowing in sections, which means you have to copy paste, sections or load sections. But you can also do that super quickly. So I think that would be really nice to do that. But I think trying to establish or decide on like a real, text typeface that you're going to use the most, and then trying to turn that into a grid, and then maybe testing a couple of the possibilities of that grid. I think that would be really nice, based on the sketches you did already.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. By the way, I really have the feeling that you're sitting in school. When I look at the, I just don't think about it anymore. It's weird.
Yeah, it's weird, huh? Yeah, I miss the school. Any other questions? Because otherwise I'm gonna leave you so you can have a break before Marina's talk starts, and so that I have a break before the next lecture starts in like 15 minutes. And if you have questions later, if like during the weekend or like later today, you think, oh shit, I what was the name of this, or etc., then you just post it in the channel. I don't think I'll be posting anything tonight, because basically right after next meeting, I have to like drive like crazy to make my mom happy. So that will be tomorrow. So I'm gonna break my own promise of not uploading anything during the weekend, because I think I will do that tomorrow. Just so you know, but you don't have to upload anything. But, so if you have questions, just post them. Like Lois did, that's really fine, because sometimes I mean, there's always someone who found a solution for something already, or has the same problem. So I think that's really nice to be able to help each other and to answer questions so that everyone can also read the answers or possible solutions. Okay, well then, thanks for your for these 3 hours of your life.
Yes, thank you. And have a nice
Thanks.
Thanks, you too. Have a nice day.
Bye.
Have a nice
Bye.
weekend. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
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 Thank you.